At 8:30 hours on April 22nd, 1945, Soviet artillery batteries of the First Belarusian Front opened fire on the center of Berlin for the first time. The targets were the Spree bridges, the northern railway stations, and the government district. 96 shells struck the heart of the German capital within minutes. The forward elements of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces had reached Biesdorf, on the eastern outskirts of the city. They were now 10 kilometers from the Reich Chancellery. That same afternoon, in the cramped map room of the Führerbunker, 18 meters beneath the Chancellery garden, Adolf Hitler learned that SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner had not launched his ordered counterattack. Army Detachment Steiner had not moved. For several minutes, witnesses reported Hitler said nothing. Then he declared for the first time that the war was lost. He announced he would remain in Berlin and take his own life before the Soviets could capture him. From this moment forward, the question of escape became purely theoretical. The military situation made departure impossible. This is the documented account of why no escape could succeed. The encirclement of Berlin did not occur suddenly. It was the culmination of a Soviet offensive that began on January 12, 1945, with the Vistula Ode operation. In 17 days, the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov advanced from the Vistula River to the Oder, a distance of approximately 500 kilometers. By January 31st, Soviet forces stood 60 kilometers east of Berlin along the Oder River. The German Army Group Vistula, initially commanded by Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, held a line that existed more on paper than in reality. When the Soviet Berlin offensive commenced on April 16th, the force ratio was overwhelming. The three Soviet fronts committed to the operation, the First Belarusian Front, the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev, and the Second Belarusian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, comprised 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, and 3,255 truck-mounted Katyusha rocket launchers. Facing this force was Army Group Vistula, with approximately 200,000 men, 750 tanks and assault guns, and 1,500 artillery pieces. The ratio of artillery concentration reached 250 guns per kilometer of front in the Soviet assault sectors. On April 16th, when the offensive began, the Soviet preliminary bombardment employed approximately 1 million artillery shells along the Oder-Neisse line, one of the largest artillery barrages in military history. The Battle of the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin, lasted 4 days, from April 16th to April 19th. The defensive positions were held by elements of the German Ninth Army under General Theodor Busse. Despite stubborn resistance, the positions were overrun. By the evening of April 19th, the First Belarusian Front had broken through the final German defensive line. The road to Berlin lay open. Understanding why escape was impossible requires examining the military geography of the encirclement. Berlin's defense was organized into 4 concentric rings. The first was positioned approximately 32 kilometers from the city center. The second was 16 kilometers out. The third followed the S-Bahn suburban rail network. The fourth, designated the Zied Ring, Zied for Citadel, surrounded the government district itself. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, both the outer and middle rings had been penetrated. The First Belarusian Front was advancing from the east and north. The First Ukrainian Front had broken through Army Group Center and was approaching from the south. On April 21st, Soviet forward units reached Treuenbrietzen, 65 kilometers southwest of Berlin. The noose was closing. On April 23rd, the last physical link between the German Ninth Army and Berlin was severed. The Soviet First Belarusian Front and First Ukrainian Front continued tightening the encirclement. By April the 24th, elements of both fronts completed the full investment of the city. The following day, April the 25th, the encirclement was consolidated. Soviet units had penetrated the S-Bahn defensive ring. Berlin was sealed. Also on April 25th, at approximately 1640 hours, Soviet and American forces made contact near Torgau on the Elbe River. Germany was now physically split in two. The Führerbunker was trapped in an isolated pocket, surrounded by Soviet forces, with no land route to either the Western Allies or to German forces in the south. The distances involved were small but impassable. From the Reich Chancellery to the nearest Soviet lines was, by April the 27th, measured in city blocks rather than kilometers. By April the 28th, the Soviets had crossed the Landwehr Canal, the last major obstacle between them and the Führerbunker. The distance from the canal to the bunker was less than 2 kilometers. Hitler's final strategic plan centered on 3 relief operations that existed primarily in his imagination. The first was the Steiner attack from the north. The second was the advance of General Walter Wenck's 12th Army from the southwest. The third was the breakout of General Theodor Buss's 9th Army from the southeast. Army Detachment Steiner, despite its designation as an army, consisted of approximately 10,000 to 15,000 personnel. Its equipment included some Hitler Youth members, Luftwaffe ground personnel, Kriegsmarine dock workers, and approximately a dozen captured French tanks from 1940. When General Steiner assessed his forces against the First Belarusian Front, he found himself outnumbered approximately 10 to 1. He refused to attack. On April the 27th, he was relieved of command, but his replacement allowed him to remain in position. The Steiner attack never materialized. The 12th Army represented a more substantial force but faced insurmountable obstacles. General Wenck had assumed command on April 10th. The army was positioned along the Elbe River, facing the American forces to the west. Its paper strength of 10 divisions actually amounted to roughly 55,000 men in approximately 5.5 divisions. The Army's mobile equipment was severely limited. A few self-propelled guns, about 40 personnel carriers, and fixed artillery positions. On April the 24th, Wenck redirected his forces eastward. His 20th Corps, including the youth divisions Clausewitz, Scharnhorst, and Theodor Körner, advanced toward Berlin. These units, composed largely of officer cadets, represented some of the best-trained personnel remaining to the German army. They covered 24 kilometers before being halted at the tip of Lake Schwielo, southwest of Potsdam. They were still 32 kilometers from Berlin. On April 28th, Wenck reported to the German Supreme Army Command that his army had been forced back along the entire front. Relief of Berlin was no longer possible. The Ninth Army, encircled in the Halbe pocket southeast of Berlin, attempted to break through Soviet lines to link with the 12th Army. The army had fewer than 1,000 guns, approximately 79 tanks, and perhaps 150 to 200 operational armored vehicles. Between April 24th and May 1st, remnants of the Ninth Army fought their way westward. Approximately 25,000 soldiers reached the 12th Army's lines. The casualties on both sides were severe. Nearly 30,000 Germans were buried after the battle in the cemetery at Halbe, making it the largest war cemetery in Germany from World War II. None of these operations came close to Berlin. None created a corridor through which Hitler could escape. By April 27th, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete. The German forces inside the city numbered approximately 45,000 soldiers from several depleted Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions, supplemented by approximately 40,000 Volkssturm militia members and Hitler Youth. SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Wenck commanded the central government district, including the Reich Chancellery and Führerbunker. His core force consisted of approximately 800 members of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Guard Battalion. His total command numbered over 2,000 men. The geography of the final days measured in hundreds of meters. On April 27th, the 3rd Shock Army reached the Victory Column in the Tiergarten and advanced toward the Moltke Bridge over the Spree River. The bridge was 600 meters from the Reichstag. German demolition charges damaged the bridge but left it passable to infantry. By midnight, the Soviet 151st and 171st Rifle Divisions had secured a bridgehead. On April 28th, General Hans Krebs, Chief of Staff of the OKH, made his last telephone call from the Führerbunker to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Krebs reported that if relief did not arrive within 48 hours, all would be lost. It was already too late. By April 30th, the day of Hitler's death, Soviet forces were attacking the Reichstag building, which stood less than 1 kilometer from the Reich Chancellery. The 12.8-centimeter Flak guns on the Zoo Flak Tower, 2 kilometers away, provided supporting fire for the German defenders. The Reichstag was stormed. Soviet troops entered the building that evening. On the morning of April 30th, General Weidling informed Hitler that the defenders would likely exhaust their ammunition that night. At approximately 1300 hours, Weidling received permission to attempt a breakout. By 1530 hours, Hitler was dead. The question of aerial evacuation has persisted in popular discussion. The documented facts demonstrate its impossibility by late April. On April 26th, the last operational airstrip in central Berlin was an improvised stretch of the east-west axis boulevard near the Brandenburg Gate. This strip was under constant Soviet artillery fire. On April 28th, test pilot Hanna Reich and Luftwaffe General Robert Ritter von Greim flew into Berlin in an Arado R-96 trainer aircraft. The approach required flying at rooftop level through Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Von Greim was wounded during the landing approach. They departed on the night of April 28th to 29th, barely avoiding being shot down. This was the last aircraft to leave central Berlin. By April 29th, no landing strip remained operational. Soviet forces controlled the areas surrounding any potential evacuation route. The concentration of anti-aircraft assets, both dedicated systems and direct fire weapons capable of engaging low-flying aircraft, made any flight from the city center a near-certain death sentence. The Soviet Air Force maintained continuous patrols over Berlin. The available aircraft, even if a strip had remained, were limited to small liaison or training aircraft. The Führerbunker contained Hitler, Eva Braun, Joseph Goebbels and his family, Martin Bormann, and numerous staff members. No practical evacuation of this group by air was possible. The Soviet command assessed the military situation with precision. Marshal Zhukov's headquarters tracked the progressive collapse of German defensive positions on detailed maps updated hourly. The rate of Soviet advance through the city, street by street, building by building, was documented in daily operational reports. On the German side, the assessments were recorded by General Weidling in his diary. On April 28th, he wrote that the troops could not hold out more than another 2 days because ammunition would be exhausted. He suggested a breakout and emphasized that the suffering of Berlin's civilian population could thereby be ended. Hitler rejected the proposal. On April 29th, Weidling noted that even the bravest soldier cannot fight without ammunition. On April 30th, Weidling recorded that he had reached the chancellery through house ruins and half-collapsed cellars. At approximately 15:15 hours, he was informed that Hitler had committed suicide. The Federal Court of Berchtesgaden, beginning in 1952, interviewed 42 witnesses about Hitler's death behind closed doors to prevent testimonies from influencing one another. After 4 years of investigation, Judge Heinrich Stephanus concluded that there could no longer be the slightest doubt that Hitler took his own life in the Chancellery on April 30th, 1945. A death certificate was issued on February 25th, 1956. The impossibility of Hitler's escape was not a matter of conjecture or speculation. It was determined by measurable factors: distances, force ratios, ammunition supplies, available transport, and the rate of Soviet advance. On April 25th, Berlin was encircled by forces outnumbering the defenders by more than 20-1. By April 27th, the relief forces had been stopped 32 kilometers from the city. By April 30th, Soviet troops were less than 1 kilometer from the Führerbunker. The last aircraft had departed 2 days earlier. No land route existed through the Soviet encirclement. The German commanders who survived the war, Wenck, Weidling, and others, consistently stated in their post-war testimonies that relief of Berlin was never strategically feasible. They conducted their operations to save soldiers and civilians, not to rescue Hitler. The final days of the Second World War in Europe were determined by logistics, geography, and the overwhelming force deployed by the Soviet Union for the capture of Berlin. Hitler's death in the bunker was not a choice among alternatives. It was the only outcome the military situation permitted. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping history alive.